1943, North Africa. When Obergefreiter Klaus Becker was captured by Allied forces, he expected torture, starvation, maybe execution. What he got instead was a trip to an American supermarket that would shatter everything the Third Reich had ever told him. Aisles overflowing with meat, chocolate bars stacked like firewood, housewives casually tossing 5 pounds of butter into their carts while his mother back in Hamburg was rationing a single egg for a week. But here's what really broke him. If America had all this abundance, why did Germany's leaders tell him they were the ones who were starving?
Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. In the spring of 1943, the war had already swallowed Europe whole. Germany was running on empty. Every single thing a person needed to live was controlled by little paper cards with stamps on them. You could not buy bread without a card. You could not buy milk without a card. You could not even buy a single egg without showing your papers to a shopkeeper who would mark it down in a ledger with suspicious eyes. The cards told you when you could eat and how much. Most days, it was not enough. The coffee people drank was not real coffee. It was made from acorns and burnt grain, bitter and brown, but tasting nothing like the rich drink people remembered from before the war. The bread had sawdust mixed into the flour to make it stretch further. Mothers would stand in lines for 3 hours in the cold rain just to buy a few potatoes, and sometimes when they reached the front of the line, there were no potatoes left. Children went to bed hungry most nights. Old people died quietly in their apartments because there was no heat and no food and no one had time to check on them. This was normal now. This was life. But the government told a different story. Every evening, the radio crackled to life with the voice of Joseph Goebbels, the propaganda minister who spoke like a preacher on fire. Germany was winning, he said. The armies were strong. The Reich would last 1,000 years. And America? America was weak. America was falling apart. The Jews who controlled their banks had ruined everything. Their cities were crumbling. Their people were starving in the streets. America could barely feed itself, let alone fight a war across an ocean. The soldiers believed this because they had to. When you are cold and hungry and far from home, you need to believe your sacrifice means something. You need to believe the enemy is worse off than you are. Klaus Becker believed it too. He was 23 years old, with blonde hair cut military short and blue eyes that had seen too much sand and blood. He had joined the Wehrmacht at 19, proud to serve, proud to be part of something bigger than himself. His mother had cried when he left their small apartment in Hamburg, but his father shook his hand like a man and told him to make Germany proud. Klaus promised he would. North Africa was nothing like Hamburg. The sun burned like an angry god. The sand got into everything, your food, your water, your lungs, your thoughts. Klaus and his unit dug trenches and fired at shapes in the distance and tried not to think about home. They ate canned meat that tasted like metal and hard biscuits that broke your teeth. They drank water that was warm and tasted like rust. At night, Klaus would lie in his bedroll and remember his mother's potato soup, thin as it was. He would remember walking to the bakery on Sunday mornings when he was a boy, when bread was still bread and life was still normal. Then the Allies came. The British and the Americans pushed through the desert with tanks and planes and more ammunition than Klaus had ever seen. His unit fought hard, but the orders got confused and the supply lines broke down, and one morning Klaus woke up with his hands in the air and a British rifle pointed at his chest. Just like that, the war was over for him. He expected to die. The propaganda had been clear. The Allies took no prisoners. They were butchers. They were savages. But instead of shooting him, the British soldier gave him water. Real water, cool and clean. Klaus drank it and waited for the bullet that never came. They put him on a truck with other prisoners, then a ship. The ship was crowded and smelled like unwashed bodies and fear. But there was food, not much, but more than Klaus had eaten in months. Bread that was actually bread. Soup with real vegetables floating in it. An American sailor walked past eating an orange, just eating it casually like it was nothing, and Klaus stared because he had not seen an orange in 4 years. Someone said they were going to America. Klaus did not believe it at first. Why would they take prisoners all the way to America? It made no sense. But the ship kept moving west, away from Africa, away from Europe, away from everything Klaus had ever known. The voyage took weeks. Klaus spent most of it below deck, trying not to think, trying not to hope, trying not to imagine what would happen when they arrived. Other prisoners talked quietly in German. Some were angry, some were scared, some seemed relieved that the fighting was over. Klaus said nothing. He just waited. When the ship finally docked, they were herded onto trains. American trains, long and powerful, nothing like the struggling locomotives back home that barely ran anymore because there was no coal. These trains had cushioned seats. They had windows that were not broken. They moved fast and smooth across a landscape that made Klaus press his face to the glass in disbelief. America was not destroyed. America was not starving. America was enormous and green and completely untouched by war. They passed through farmland that stretched forever in every direction, fields of corn and wheat so vast Klaus could not see where they ended. They passed through small towns with white churches and neat houses and stores with lights on. They passed factories with smokestacks pumping white clouds into the sky, factories that were working, producing, building things. There were no bomb craters, no burned buildings, no rubble. Nothing was destroyed. Klaus felt something cold settle in his stomach. This was not what he had been told. This was not what Goebbels had described on the radio. This was not a country on the edge of collapse. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. The train arrived at Camp Ruston in Louisiana on a humid afternoon in June. The air was thick and hot and smelled like pine trees and something else Klaus could not name. Spanish moss hung from the trees like old man beards. Everything was so green it hurt his eyes. The camp was surrounded by barbed wire and guard towers, but inside it looked almost peaceful. The barracks were wooden but sturdy, with real roofs and screens on the windows. There were walkways between the buildings. There was a yard where prisoners could walk around. There was a building that someone said was a library. Klaus kept waiting for the other shoe to drop, for the cruelty to start, for the starvation and the beatings and all the things prisoners were supposed to suffer. Instead, they were taken to the showers. Hot water came out of the pipes. Actual hot water. Klaus stood under the spray and felt months of desert sand and sweat and fear wash away. They were given clean clothes. Thin, yes, and marked with the letters PW for prisoner of war, but clean and whole with no holes or lice. That night, they were fed in a large dining hall with long tables and benches. Klaus sat down expecting watery soup and stale bread. Instead, an American soldier in a white apron came around with trays of food. Real food. White bread so soft Klaus thought it might be cake. Butter, actual yellow butter in little squares. Meat, potatoes, carrots, coffee that smelled like real coffee. Klaus stared at his tray. The German soldier next to him stared at his tray. No one spoke. No one moved. Then someone started eating, and the spell broke, and Klaus picked up his fork with a hand that shook slightly. The food was good. The food was better than good. The food was better than anything Klaus had eaten in years, maybe better than anything he had ever eaten. He thought of his mother standing in line for turnips. He thought of his little sister who had written him a letter saying she was so hungry all the time. He thought of the radio voice promising that Germany was winning, that America was weak. He looked around the dining hall at the other prisoners eating in silence, at the American guards standing along the walls, at the electric lights buzzing overhead. He looked at his half-eaten plate of food that would have fed his entire family for 2 days back home. And Klaus Becker felt the first crack appear in everything he thought about the world. The next morning, a guard told him he would be going on a work detail. Klaus lined up with 20 other prisoners, and they were loaded into the back of a truck. No chains, no guns pointed at them, just a bored-looking American corporal who chewed gum and told them in broken German to sit down and behave. The truck drove through the Louisiana countryside, past more impossible farmland, past houses with painted shutters and flower gardens, past children playing in yards who stopped and waved at the truck. They pulled up to a building made of brick with big glass windows and a sign Klaus could not read because it was in English. The corporal told them they were going to help load supplies. The doors at the front of the building opened by themselves as people walked through them. They just slid open like magic. Klaus stopped walking. Another prisoner bumped into him from behind. The corporal gestured for them to go inside. Klaus stepped through the automatic doors into the supermarket, and his brain simply could not process what his eyes were seeing. The building was huge, bigger than any store he had ever been in. Rows and rows of shelves stretched back into the distance, and every shelf was full. Not just full, overflowing. Cans stacked 6 high, boxes of cereal in 20 different colors, glass jars of jam and pickles and things Klaus did not recognize. A whole aisle just for bread, dozens of loaves, white and brown and braided, none of it rationed, none of it controlled, just sitting there for anyone to buy. He walked deeper into the store like a man in a dream. There was meat behind a glass counter, red and pink and white, more meat than Klaus had seen in his entire life. A woman in a floral dress stood at the counter telling the butcher she wanted 5 pounds of pork chops. 5 pounds, just for herself, just for one meal maybe. The butcher wrapped it up in white paper and handed it to her, and she put it in her cart like it was nothing. Klaus moved to another aisle. Chocolate. Entire shelves of chocolate bars stacked like firewood. He remembered the Christmas before the war when his mother had given him one small square of chocolate, and it had been the most precious thing he owned. Here there were hundreds of bars, thousands maybe. Pyramids of oranges glowed under the lights. Apples, bananas, grapes, fruit just sitting there in piles, and some of it was bruised or overripe, and no one cared because there was so much more. A mother let her child take a grape and eat it while they shopped, just gave it to him, wasted it. Klaus felt dizzy. His hands went cold. This could not be real. This had to be a setup, a propaganda film, something staged to trick the prisoners into thinking America is strong. But there were too many people shopping, too many carts full of food, too many casual conversations about what to make for dinner. You could not fake this many people living this way. The corporal called out that it was time to load the truck. Klaus and the other prisoners carried crates of canned goods and sacks of flour and boxes of fresh vegetables out to the waiting vehicle. The prisoners did not speak. They worked in stunned silence, each man alone with his own breaking thoughts. On the ride back to camp, Klaus pressed his forehead against the warm metal side of the truck and closed his eyes. He thought about the radio broadcasts. He thought about the promises. He thought about every speech he had heard about German superiority and American weakness and the glorious future of the Reich. He thought about the supermarket with its automatic doors and pyramids of oranges and women buying 5 pounds of butter like it meant nothing. And Klaus Becker realized with absolute certainty that he had been lied to about everything. The weeks that followed became a strange education in everything Klaus thought he understood about power and wealth and how the world actually worked. Every single day brought new evidence that contradicted every single thing the propaganda ministry had burned into his brain since he was a teenager. The camp kitchen was the first lesson that would not stop teaching. Klaus had kitchen duty on rotation with other prisoners, which meant he got to see behind the scenes of how the Americans fed over 2,000 German soldiers 3 times a day. The kitchen was bigger than most restaurants back home, with industrial stoves that never went cold and ovens that could bake 100 loaves of bread at once. Giant pots bubbled with stew that had actual chunks of beef floating in it. Whole chickens roasted on spits, fat dripping and sizzling. The smell alone was enough to make Klaus feel guilty, like he was betraying his starving family just by breathing it in. The American cooks were not even soldiers. They were civilians hired from nearby towns, men and women who came to work in the morning and went home at night to their own houses and their own families. They laughed while they worked. They listened to music on a radio in the corner. One woman named Betty had a son fighting in Europe, and she still smiled at the German prisoners and asked them in simple English if the eggs were cooked enough. On Sundays, there was ice cream. Actual ice cream, cold and sweet and served in metal bowls after lunch. The first time Klaus tasted it, he thought it was some kind of test or trick. Ice cream required fresh milk and sugar and ice and machines to freeze it, all things that should be impossible in wartime. But here it was, vanilla and chocolate, and the American guards ate it too, like it was the most normal thing in the world. Klaus watched a young private eat 2 bowls and then complained that he was too full. Too full. The words did not even make sense anymore. Klaus wrote letters home, but he could not tell his family about the food. How could he? How could he write to his mother that he was eating better as a prisoner in America than she was eating as a free woman in Hamburg? The censors would cut it out anyway. So he wrote about the weather and the trees and how he was healthy and safe, and he did not mention the white bread or the butter or the ice cream that haunted his dreams. Then came the day the Coca-Cola truck arrived. It pulled up to the camp gate on a Tuesday morning, bright red and shining in the sun like something from another planet. The driver hopped out whistling and started unloading wooden crates filled with glass bottles. Klaus was on yard duty raking gravel, and he stopped to watch. The guards gathered around, and the driver started handing out bottles like he was giving away water. One of the guards walked over to where Klaus was standing and held out a bottle, condensation running down the cold glass. Klaus took it because refusing seemed more dangerous than accepting. He had never seen Coca-Cola before. The propaganda posters back home showed American products as symbols of decadence and moral decay, capitalism rotting from the inside. He twisted off the cap and the bottle hissed. He smelled something sweet and strange. He took a sip. It was cold. It was sweet. It fizzed on his tongue and burned slightly going down his throat in a way that was not unpleasant. It tasted like nothing Klaus had ever experienced, like liquid sugar and bubbles and something dark he couldn't name. He thought about the coffee substitute his mother drank every morning, bitter and thin, made from burnt acorns because there was no real coffee left in Germany. He thought about his little sister saving her ration of milk to make it last 3 days. He looked at the Coca-Cola truck with its hundreds of bottles, at the American guards drinking them casually while talking about a baseball game, at the driver who would go back to the bottling plant and get more because there was always more. Klaus sat down on the ground, still holding the half-empty bottle, and something inside him started to break in a way that could not be fixed. The work details outside the camp made everything worse. Klaus was assigned to a farm 10 miles away, along with a dozen other prisoners. They rode there in a truck every morning and worked in the fields doing whatever the farmer needed. The farmer was an older man named Mr. Johnson, who had fought in the First War and walked with a limp. He did not speak German, and Klaus did not speak much English, but they communicated through gestures and the universal language of planting and harvesting. The farm had machines Klaus had only seen in books, a tractor that could plow a field in hours instead of days, an irrigation system that brought water directly to the crops through pipes buried underground, a barn with electric lights and concrete floors and tools that were not broken or rusted. Mr. Johnson owned all of this. Not the government, not some collective, just one man who farmed his own land and lived in a white house with a front porch and an American flag hanging by the door. His wife brought lunch out to the fields every day at noon. Sandwiches wrapped in wax paper, thick with ham and cheese and lettuce. Mason jars full of cold lemonade with ice cubes floating in it. Cookies that were still warm from the oven. She laid it all out on a folding table under a tree and told the prisoners in slow, careful English to help themselves. She smiled when she said it. A real smile, not afraid, not hateful, just kind. Klaus ate his sandwich and watched Mrs. Johnson walk back to the house, housewives swang, and he could not understand it. These people knew he was German. They knew he had fought for Hitler. Their own son might be dying in Europe right now fighting against Klaus's former comrades. And still, they brought him lemonade and smiled and treated him like a human being instead of a monster.
On Sunday, a church group came to visit the camp. Old women mostly, with a few men too old to fight. They brought boxes of donated items, books in German, newspapers, decks of cards, bars of soap, writing paper. One woman with white hair and glasses walked up to Klaus and asked him in broken German if he needed anything. Her accent was terrible. She pronounced the words all wrong. But she was trying. Klaus shook his head because his throat was too tight to speak. The woman patted his hand with her soft, wrinkled fingers and said in English, "You are just a boy." She said it sadly, like it hurt her to see him there. Then she moved on to the next prisoner. Klaus stood there holding a bar of soap that smelled like lavender, and he realized he did not understand anything anymore. The enemy was not supposed to be kind. The enemy was supposed to hate you and want you dead. That was how war worked. That was what made it possible to shoot at shapes in the desert and not think about the fact that they were human beings with mothers and sweethearts and favorite foods. But if the enemy gave you ice cream and Coca-Cola and smiled at you and called you just a boy, then what did that make you? What did that make the war? What did that make every reason Klaus had been given for why the fighting had to happen? He sat on his bunk that night and tried to add it all up. The supermarket with its endless food, the industrial kitchen that never ran out, the Coca-Cola truck, the farm with its machines and its abundance, the kindness of strangers who should have hated him, the lemonade and the ice cream and the white bread and the automatic doors, and all of it while his family starved and his city burned and his government promised victory that was always just around the corner. Klaus put his head in his hands and felt everything he thought he knew about the world start to crumble like old bread. If America was this strong, this wealthy, this capable of feeding its own people and its enemies at the same time, then why would they ever need to invade Europe? And if they did not need to invade, then why was Germany fighting them? And if the Führer had lied about American weakness, what else had he lied about? The questions had no good answers. So Klaus stopped asking them out loud and started asking them in the dangerous quiet of his own mind, where they grew and spread like cracks in a dam that was about to break. The turning point came on Thanksgiving Day in November of 1944. Klaus had been in America for almost 18 months by then, long enough that the shock had worn down into something heavier and more permanent, a kind of understanding that sat in his chest like a stone. The camp had announced there would be a special meal to celebrate the American holiday, but Klaus expected nothing more than the usual generous portions they received every day. He was not prepared for what happened. The dining hall had been decorated with paper turkeys and colored leaves cut from construction paper. American flags hung on the walls next to signs that said Happy Thanksgiving in both English and German. The long tables were covered with white cloths instead of being bare wood. The German prisoners filed in quietly, confused by the ceremony of it all, unsure what was expected of them. Then the food came out, and Klaus forgot how to breathe. Whole roasted turkeys, golden brown and glistening, carried out on massive platters by the kitchen staff, who were smiling like it was Christmas morning.
Mountains of mashed potatoes whipped smooth and white with butter melting in yellow pools on top. Bowls of dark gravy that smelled like meat and herbs. Stuffing baked crispy on the edges. Green beans with almonds. Cranberry sauce both jellied and whole berry. Rolls so soft and warm that steam rose when you tore them open. And then the pies, sweet potato and pumpkin and apple lined up on a side table with towers of whipped cream. Klaus sat down at his assigned spot and stared at the empty plate in front of him. Around him, other prisoners were doing the same, frozen in disbelief. This was not prison food. This was not even restaurant food. This was the kind of feast you saw in paintings of medieval banquets or stories about kings. This was food that did not exist anymore in the real world, or at least not in any world Klaus knew. The camp commander stood up to give a speech. He was a colonel named Patterson, a tired-looking man in his 50s who treated the prisoners firmly but fairly. He spoke in English and a translator repeated his words in German. Patterson talked about the meaning of Thanksgiving, about being grateful even in hard times, about remembering that every person deserves dignity and respect. He said that after the war was over, the men in this room would go home and help rebuild a better world. He said he hoped they would remember this meal and understand what freedom and prosperity could look like when people worked together instead of conquering each other. Then he sat down and told everyone to eat. The prisoners served themselves family style, passing the heavy platters and bowls around the tables. Klaus took a slice of turkey and his hand shook so badly he almost dropped it. He spoons mashed potatoes onto his plate. He poured gravy. He took a roll. He looked down at more food than his entire family would see in a month. And Klaus started to cry. Not quiet tears that you could hide, not the kind of crying you could swallow down and pretend was not happening. Deep, shaking sobs that came from somewhere Klaus didn't know existed inside him. His fork clattered to the plate, his shoulders heaved. He put his face in his hands and wept like a child, while around him other prisoners pretended not to notice because some of them were crying too.
He cried for his mother, standing in bread lines in the rain. He cried for his little sister, who had written that she was always cold and always hungry. He cried for his father, who had been so proud when Klaus joined the Wehrmacht, so certain that Germany would win, so convinced that their sacrifices meant something. He cried for every lie he had believed and every truth he had ignored. He cried because he was sitting in an enemy prison eating a feast while his country starved, and the feast was proof that everything his leaders had told him was a lie. After dinner, Klaus walked outside into the cool November evening. The Louisiana air smelled like pine and wood smoke. Stars were coming out overhead, the same stars that shone over Hamburg, but somehow looking different here. He found a quiet spot behind one of the barracks and sat on the ground with his back against the wall. He thought about the Führer's speeches on the radio. He thought about the rallies and the marching and the promises of a 1,000-year Reich. He thought about how certain everyone had been that Germany was superior, that Germans were stronger and smarter and more disciplined than the soft, decadent Americans who would collapse at the first sign of real war. He thought about how the propaganda had shown American cities in ruins and American people starving while German soldiers marched to glory. But Klaus had seen the truth now. America was not weak. America was not starving. America was so strong and so wealthy that it could fight a war on two sides of the world and still give its prisoners turkey dinner with 3 kinds of pie. Germany had thrown everything it had into conquest and still could not feed its own children. America had built systems that created so much abundance they could afford to be generous even to their enemies. The realization settled over Klaus like winter frost. Germany had not lost the war because the German people were weak. Germany had lost because the entire foundation was rotten. You could not build strength on lies. You could not create prosperity through conquest. You could not make a nation great by telling people they were superior while they slowly starved.
In the weeks after Thanksgiving, Klaus started attending the camp education programs. The Americans had set up classes in basic English, American history, and democratic principles. At first, Klaus went because he was bored and it was something to do. Then he went because he wanted to understand. Then he went because he needed to know how a country could be this different from everything he had been taught was possible. The classes were taught by a mix of soldiers and civilian volunteers. They showed newsreels that had been forbidden in Germany, uncensored footage of the war from perspectives Klaus had never seen. They showed films about the concentration camps that had been liberated, images so horrible that several prisoners walked out and refused to come back. They showed how the American government worked, with elections and courts and laws that even the president had to follow. Klaus resisted at first. Part of him still wanted to believe that this was all elaborate propaganda, that the truth was somewhere in the middle between what Germany had told him and what America was showing him. But the evidence was too strong. The supermarkets were real. The abundance was real. The kindness was real. And the newsreels showing the camps, those were real too. And they were German camps, run by German officers, following German orders. At night, Klaus lay in his bunk and wrote in a diary he had started keeping, practicing his English and working through his thoughts on paper because they were too dangerous to say out loud. He wrote, "I thought America was weak, but they are strong. I thought Germany was honest, but we were lied to. I thought the war was about survival, but it was about power and hate. I do not know who I am anymore if everything I believed was false." He wrote, "The abundance here is not propaganda. It is proof that freedom works. People who are free to think and work and build create more than people who are told what to do by leaders who lie. This is not a weakness. This is a strength I never understood." He wrote, "I do not know what I will tell my family when I go home. How do you explain that the enemy treated you better than your own country did? How do you say that everything we suffered was for nothing? How do you admit that we were wrong about everything?" Klaus closed the diary and stared at the ceiling of the barracks. Around him, other prisoners snored or whispered or lay awake with their own thoughts. Outside, a guard walked past, boots crunching on gravel. Somewhere in the distance, a truck engine started up. Normal sounds, prison sounds. But Klaus was not really in prison anymore. His body was behind barbed wire, but his mind had broken free of something much stronger. He understood now that the war had not been about defending Germany. It had been about defending a lie. And Klaus had fought for that lie, and nearly died for that lie, and lost years of his life to that lie. But he would not believe it anymore. Whatever happened next, whatever Germany looked like when he finally went home, Klaus Becker would carry the truth with him. He had learned what real strength looked like. He had learned that power without freedom was just tyranny dressed up in uniforms. And he had learned that abundance was not a sin, but a choice that societies made about how to organize themselves and treat their people. And he had learned it all while eating turkey dinner in a Louisiana prison camp, which was maybe the strangest and most important education any soldier had ever received. The war ended in May of 1945, but Klaus did not go home until February of 1946. The Americans kept the prisoners while they figured out logistics and paperwork and which parts of Germany were safe enough to return people to. Klaus did not mind the wait. Every extra month in America was another month of regular meals and safety and time to prepare himself for what he would find when he finally went back. When the day came, Klaus packed his few belongings into a canvas duffel bag the Americans had given him. He had the clothes on his back. He had a worn English dictionary he had studied until the pages were soft as cloth. He had a small book about American government and democracy that one of the teachers had given him. He had a letter from Mrs. Johnson, the farmer's wife who had brought him lemonade in the fields. She had written it carefully in simple English and had her friend who spoke better English help translate it. The letter said she hoped he would have a good life and that she was praying for him and for Germany. Klaus folded it carefully and put it in his shirt pocket close to his heart. But the most important thing Klaus carried was invisible. It was the knowledge of what he had seen. It was the understanding of how wrong everything had been. It was hope, fragile and strange, that maybe something better was possible if enough people learned the same lessons he had learned. The ship that carried prisoners back to Europe was crowded and cold, and nothing like the prison camp had been. Men were packed tight in the holds, sleeping in hammocks strung close together, eating simple rations that were still better than what waited for them at home. Some prisoners were excited to return. Some were terrified. Most were quiet, lost in their own thoughts about what they would find. Klaus stood on deck as the ship approached Hamburg, and his stomach turned to ice. The city he remembered did not exist anymore. The port was a skeleton of twisted metal and broken concrete. Buildings were hollow shells with no roofs and empty windows like dead eyes. Whole neighborhoods had been flattened into fields of rubble where nothing stood higher than a man's waist. Smoke still rose in places from fires that had never quite gone out. They docked, and Klaus walked down the gangway onto German soil for the first time in almost 3 years. The air smelled like ash and sewage and something else, something rotten he did not want to identify. People moved through the ruins like ghosts, thin and gray and hollow-eyed. Children with legs like sticks picked through trash piles looking for anything useful. Old women pulled carts loaded with salvaged bricks. No one smiled. No one spoke louder than a whisper. Klaus walked through streets he used to know, trying to find landmarks that no longer existed. The bakery where his mother had bought bread was gone. The school he had attended was rubble. The church where his family went on Christmas was just walls with no roof and pews scattered like broken teeth. He passed people and they looked through him like he was not there, everyone too exhausted to care about one more soldier coming home. His family's apartment building was still standing, or at least parts of it were. The top 2 floors had been blown off, but the lower floors remained, windows covered with boards and blankets instead of glass. Klaus climbed stairs that were cracked and missing pieces. He knocked on the door that had been his home. His mother answered and for a moment did not recognize him. Then she made a sound that was not quite a word and pulled him inside with hands that were all bone and papery skin. She had aged 20 years in 3. Her hair was completely white. Her face was lined deep as tree bark. She held Klaus and cried into his shoulder, and he could feel every rib in her back. His father sat at the table in the main room, staring at nothing. He had been injured in an air raid, his mother explained quietly. Shrapnel in his leg that never healed right. He couldn't work anymore. He barely spoke anymore. Klaus shook his father's hand and felt how weak the grip was, how the proud, strong man who had sent him off to war had become this hollow shell. His little sister was not there. She had died in the winter of 1944, his mother said. Pneumonia, no medicine, no heat. She just got weaker and weaker, and then one morning she did not wake up. She was 15. They sat at the table and his mother served watery soup made from turnips and some kind of grain Klaus did not recognize. 3 small bowls. This was dinner for the whole family. Klaus ate his portion and tasted nothing. He thought about the Thanksgiving turkey and wanted to scream. He tried to tell them about America, about the supermarkets and the abundance and the kindness he had been shown. His mother listened and shook her head slowly. "Propaganda," she whispered. "They wanted you to think that. They wanted to break you." But Klaus had known she would say this. He had prepared for it. "Mama," he said gently, "I was there for almost 3 years. You cannot fake that many people living that way. You cannot stage an entire country. It was real. All of it was real." His father spoke for the first time, his voice rough as gravel. then we lost more than the war. Yes, Klaus thought, but did not say. We lost the truth. We lost years believing lies. We lost everything that mattered while chasing something that was never real. In the months that followed, Klaus worked whatever jobs he could find. He cleared rubble. He stood in line for ration cards. He learned to live with constant hunger again, though it was harder now that he knew it did not have to be this way. He watched people struggle and suffer and blame everyone except the leaders who had lied to them. He watched his father fade a little more each day until he died quietly in his sleep, as if he had just given up. But Klaus did not give up. He had seen another way. He knew what was possible when people were free and systems were built on truth instead of lies. So he started small. He talked to other former prisoners who had been in America. He found men who had seen the same things he had, who carried the same strange education. Together, they started to imagine what Germany could become if they rebuilt it on different foundations. Klaus opened a small grocery store in 1949 when things had stabilized enough for small businesses to exist again. It was nothing like the American supermarkets, just a single room with shelves he built himself. But he organized it the way he remembered. Clean, orderly, with prices clearly marked, and no favoritism for who got what. People could choose what they wanted instead of being told what they would get. It was a tiny piece of American abundance transplanted into German rubble. He married in 1951 a woman named Anna who had survived the war working in a factory. He told her about his time in America, and she believed him because she could see the truth of it in his eyes. They had children, 2 boys and a girl, and Klaus taught them to think for themselves and question authority, and never believe anyone who promised easy answers to complicated problems.
Years later, when Klaus was an old man with white hair and grandchildren, someone asked him if he resented being captured, if he was angry about the years he lost as a prisoner. Klaus thought about it carefully before answering. "Being captured saved my life," he said, "not from bullets, from lies. I learned that a nation's strength is not measured by how many people it can conquer, but by how well it takes care of its own people. I learned that abundance is not a sin. It is what happens when you build systems based on freedom instead of fear. I learned that even enemies can show you humanity when your own leaders have forgotten what humanity means." He paused and looked out the window of his small grocery store, now modernized and successful, serving a neighborhood that had been rebuilt from ash. "I learned all of that eating ice cream in a prison camp in Louisiana. Strange, is it not? The enemy taught me more about dignity and strength than my own country ever did." The person interviewing him asked what he hoped people would remember about his story. Klaus was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "I hope they remember that propaganda works both ways, that abundance is not weakness but proof of good systems, that kindness is not soft but strong, and that the truth will find you eventually, no matter how many lies you have been told. It found me in a supermarket in 1943. It changed everything I thought I knew, and it gave me a chance to help build something better from the ruins of something terrible." He looked at the old black and white photograph on his wall, a picture of him in his Wehrmacht uniform standing outside Camp Ruston in Louisiana, young and confused and about to learn the most important lessons of his life. "Those who were once enemies became teachers," Klaus said softly. "My captivity became my liberation, and I have spent every day since trying to pass those lessons forward." Outside his store, Germany hummed with life and prosperity, rebuilt on principles that included democracy and freedom and the understanding that abundance was something you created through good systems, not something you took through conquest. It was not perfect, nothing ever was, but it was better. And Klaus Becker, former prisoner of war, had helped make it so by carrying the truth home with him and refusing to let it die. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.